As I mentioned previously, most colonial railways, or those with the means to, bought diesel traction in the 1950s, 60s, or earlier in some cases. However, most often than not, this traction was British built. Locomotives which were either reportedly the very best, but more often than not were the very worst, as they were not fit for the environments they had been built to run in, especially Africa. This in turn led to the steam they were supposed to replace continuing to run. That is, until the British hold was broken, and the railway could order locomotives from General Electric. Now I will state, not every British design was a flop. English electric locomotives provided to Rhodesia, Sudan, and the East African railways proved reliable and long-lasting. Kenya still saw some of these in service into the 2010s. But this was the exception, not the norm. Here in the US, we're used to the Universal Series units, starting with the U25B and the smallest being the U18B. However, the Universal truly did mean it, as export versions ran on just about every continent, and most still do. The first big customer was South African Railways, with the late 50s arrival of the U12B and U18C1, or Class 31 and 32 in South African Railways classification. Now, these were not South African Railways' first diesel design. The SAR had experimented with a gas-electric locomotive, the GE1, not actually a General Electric product, in 1923, although it hadn't been met with success. 1939 also saw 3 diesel shunters delivered from, AEG in Germany. Sorry, I'm not going to try and pronounce that. South African Railways also acquired 7 diesel hydraulics in the form of the 1DH the year after the arrival of the Class 31s. Although they were not successful, all were restored in 1967, and some were sold to Rhodesia. The Class 32s in particular would open the floodgates as GE proved they could provide a design exactly to what was wanted for these railways. In this case, a unit with a 1-co-1 truck layout for lighter laid branch lines. South African Railways, however, is an outlier on this list, as while diesels from GE and later EMD flooded in, steam still maintained somewhat of a role, as original plans for South African Railways going forward was electrification of main trunk lines, where it made sense to pay for electrification, then diesels in places where water was scarce, and steam everywhere else. This was eventually done away with by the bean counters, but that's a whole other story. The only real competition, aside from the British-built diesels that did work properly, was from the Montreal Locomotive Works. EMD made products for the Cape and meter gauge market at the time, but until the first GT26 was constructed in the 1970s, these were all 4-axle units with as little as 1500 horsepower, not enough to displace most large steam on the continent. Montreal offered their MX series. These locomotives were built to a standard design for multiple gauges in multiple countries, though most African examples are definitely function over form, being locomotives of quite a rectangular design. These units on the narrower gauges, even with the similar 1-co-1 setup to those units provided to South Africa, were rough riders and often had reliability issues. The first of GE's big home runs in Africa came in 1965 with the U20C. These 2,000 horsepower units were once again a design with South Africa in mind, becoming the 33 and 33-400 respectively. This time around, SAR wasn't the only customer, with Rhodesia Railways picking up their own to supplement Garrett's and older British diesels. Quick note here too, Rhodesia also ordered U10Bs and U11Bs from GE/Babcock and Wilcox, which were built in Spain, under contract. Oh right, these were part of the Sanction Buster units. Rhodesia was under sanctions by most of the world at this time, but these GE products still magically ended up in Rhodesia. Moving on, Zambia altogether ordered 80 between 1967 and 1980, some of which were built under license by Krupp in Germany. By 1980, they had spelled the end for nearly all Zambian steam, and were assisted in this task with smaller U15Cs. It was also possible to see some of South Africa's 65 units in times of power shortage. There's actually kind of a story here of South African Railways providing a class of 482s to Zambia during one of these power shortages in the 1980s, only for Zambia to turn them back within a week as no crews wanted to revert to working on filthy steam after working on these nice shiny new diesels. GE's biggest export hit came in 1971 with the U26C, making nearly 3,000 horsepower, and Germany's Krupp becoming a licensed builder on top of units built in the States. It was little wonder these units pretty much took over Africa and also South America. The units were also built to meter and Cape gauge, allowing Kenya Railways to buy them and finally replace Class 59 Garretts, as none of the British diesels nor the MLWs could match their performance. On the Cape gauge, South African Railways bought 255, the most purchased by any railway on either continent. Unlike most of the steam I've covered, most of these units are still running in some capacity. Proof of rugged design. Transnet, what was South African Railways, still rosters many of the U26Cs, although the U20C fleet has mostly been sold on to other countries, such as Namibia, Brazil, or Chile. Even several of the starter U18C1s and one U12B survive in South Africa. GE continues to be a dominant force in the locomotive export market, or I guess they're Wabtec now, but you get the point. Though Chinese exported diesels are starting to crop up as well, various gauge versions of the Evolution series platform are still being built and are exported or built in-house via technology transfer, as GE has proven it can make reliable locomotives for the most extreme environments. Thanks for watching. This is a little different, and I would like to cover more diesels going ahead. Looking at you, YDM4s. Steam will return next week, and it's a big one.